The history of New York begins in 1613, when the ship of a Dutch merchant named Adrian Blok burned down near the territory of modern-day Manhattan. The captain was forced to take shelter on the coast, where a local native tribe assisted the crew in surviving through the winter. The primitive locals then helped the Dutch castaways to rebuild their burnt and beached boat. Whilst this sounds like a lovely tale, researchers took issue with one little detail. How were these supposed primitive locals able to assist in the rebuilding of a modern ship? 17th century ships were very complex structures. After all, they had to be capable of crossing the vast swells of the Atlantic. Some modern shipwrights and marine experts have suggested it would be impossible to rebuild them without special training. Mainstream history suggests the Dutch could have traded along the Hudson River as early as 1609. But it wasn't until 1614 that the colony of New Netherlands was officially established. By 1625, after a small but steady influx of around 150 migrants from Holland, a protective fort was built on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Within 1 year, this small group of men, women, and children had managed to plan and construct a brick stellate fort. This fort became the capital of the new colony, being christened New Amsterdam. The next year, in 1626, amidst rising local tensions, came the famous historical event in which the Dutch colonists purchased the entire island of Manhattan from the natives, with the Dutch offering a deal consisting of beads and trinkets totaling a combined value of just $24. Sources are conflicted on the veracity of this story, with some suggesting it was a cover-up for Dutch aggressions towards the original occupants, whilst others claim it was a race-fueled attempt to make the locals appear unintelligent. This deal stirred up the winds of change into regular civil service. The first minister of New Amsterdam arrived in 1628, when the population stood at about 270 inhabitants. Over the next 4 decades, up to 1,500 new residents arrived in the city, including Jonas Bronck in 1639, the man who the famous Bronx district is named after. New Yorkers were engaged in the exchange and trade of various goods with the native people. They exported many of these items back to Europe, the most common of which was the beaver pelt. The population of the city was ever increasing, but accurate population data for that period is almost impossible to obtain. Modern official estimates suggest up to 1,500 inhabitants by 1655. Looking at the plan of 1662, we can see that the city has already been planned with a star-shaped fortress and a huge star-shaped wall. In 1664, the British invaded the city and renamed it the Province of New York in honor of King George's brother, the Duke of York. At first, the Dutch disagreed, but after a short war, they conceded the areas to the British. In 1720, a large shipyard was constructed in the area, which gave a powerful boost to the development of the city. By 1790, estimates suggest around 33,000 people lived in New York. In 1811, the first development plan was prepared, which aimed to develop streets that are almost perpendicular to its intersections. This is where the most interesting part of the city's history begins. Let's look at the very first photograph printed in the New York Daily Graphic on the 4th of March, 1882. Here we can see the slums of New York. You can see huts located on the rocky or muddy uplands. A very surprising thing to see in a major city in the United States. Some historians have suggested these pictures depict the aftermath of a natural catastrophe or even a war. Here are some of the ancient stone mounds that have been dug up out of the ruined valley. One of the most curious things, on the right, is the existence of this gas lantern. Moving on to Central Park, which is probably the most famous and recognizable place in all of New York. At first glance, the park appears as a remnant of the wildlife that stood before the construction of this grand city. But in actual fact, this park was created artificially. Russian researchers noted it was very different from the ordinary park found in Moscow, such as Izmailovsky Park, which never experienced such urban development. But for the futuristic New York territory, the park is well accustomed. In fact, there were people living in houses covering an area of 3 square kilometers. Conservative estimations have placed around 2,000 people living there during the mid-1800s, during which construction continued within the park area over land that was originally a mixture of rocky hill and dense swamp. The soil cover wasn't suitable for many plants. As a result, the soil became dry, cracked, and degraded. To remedy this, 7 million cubic meters of fertile land was brought in from outside the city. Most of the rocks were literally blasted away with the combined force of 250 tons of gunpowder. Look at this painting of 1869. This shows how people using gunpowder carts and shovels could level a rocky area of 3 square kilometers. Not only did they completely level the stone platform, but they also created a drainage system. The remaining rocky, fertile soil was planted with 270,000 trees. This is what Manhattan looked like at the beginning of the 1600s. Compare that to 1660. Look at what beaver traders can build in just 30 years. The population during this period was supposedly less than 1,000 people. So, if all this was done by so few people in the mid-1600s, then you wouldn't be too surprised by the mid-1800s that they could easily transport 7 million cubic meters of soil. Moving on from Central Park, we'll take a look at other photographs of the city. After all, they not only leveled the entire park, but they flattened the entirety of Manhattan. Check out these photos from the 1800s. With the help of shovels and gunpowder carts, they successfully ironed out every bump and hill in the city. Researchers were amazed at the scale of redevelopment. But we haven't seen the most interesting construction in New York yet. Look at this photograph. It looks like some ancient Egyptian or ancient Assyrian fortress, but in fact, it's just a reservoir. This is a fantastic structure. It was called the Croton Reservoir. In the mid-1800s, due to issues digging down into the hard rock beneath Manhattan, the reservoir was constructed above ground, raised up by a granite wall about 15 meters high and 7 meters thick. Researchers noted the disparity between the construction of this reservoir and the earlier settlements in Central Park. In regards to the park, it was seemingly easy to blast through 3 square kilometers of rock and then transport millions of tons of soil from outside of the city. Yet this reservoir had to be raised. Researchers suggested the structure is very similar to the design of an ancient fortress. Look at this ancient wall that used to surround Beijing. It could be said that they look quite similar. Perhaps the Beijing Wall was also used as a reservoir. In this next photo, the Croton Reservoir is being dismantled. It would seem that some arched vaults have opened, but most importantly, looking below, there is an entrance covered with keystone. If this is a water reservoir, then why would they make a door within it? Also, this keystone on the door looks very ancient. Researchers noted the peculiarity of the structure and how similar it was to an ancient fortress. So, was this reservoir previously a fortress? Or maybe some of the ancient fortresses were previously reservoirs? There is a video about Kitay-Gorod, the link of which will be in the description. If you watch the video, you'll be able to see the Kotovskaya Reservoir, which Russian researchers have suggested was also a fortress. They also suggest it is much older than the 19th century we are told by mainstream Russian history. They say that if the same structure was discovered far off in the wilderness, they would immediately attribute it to thousands of years ago. If this theory proved to be true, then these reservoirs would be the product of a past civilization. Here's another interesting photograph to ponder. Look at this huge white marbled rectangle. This is how the Croton Reservoir was depicted in the 19th century. One researcher suggested it was the remnants of some kind of antediluvian structure. These are also photographs of what can be found in the underground sections of New York. Historians have put forward the notion that these could have in fact been built by Native Americans. The official history of New York has proved to be foggy. The natives were documented as helping to rebuild a Dutch ship. According to official history, the locals could only build a pirogue. Researchers suggest this level of primitive construction would not have assisted in rebuilding a 17th century ship. Afterwards, a settlement in which a couple of hundred people lived built a vast bastion fortress surrounded by 4 walls. Not to mention how it was all funded via the exports of beaver pelts to Europe. Then there's Central Park, in which a 3 square kilometer area of rocky soil was leveled with gunpowder carts and shovels, before being covered in 7 million cubic meters of fertile land, all of which dragged from outside the city. Either way, it's very clear the history of New York is more than meets the eye.